Hi, Life Group leaders. I'm Ken Gaines, and I'm going to bring you this week's lesson. We are in 2 Kings, and we're going to be in chapter 19. And we've got a great lesson today, uplifting lesson. A lot of these lessons have been, lessons of judgment and, bad things happening to God's people. Not really bad things, just discipline, to get them back on the right track. But we're going to have a good story today. So back in chapter 18 of 2 Kings, the Assyrian army has been devastating the lands to the north of Judah. And they have been conquering kingdom after kingdom and coming down, building their empire up. They've taken over Israel. We learn in chapter 18 that God allowed this due to their rebellion. And they've invaded part of Judah, and they're pressing towards Jerusalem now. And the king of the Assyrian army is King Sennacherib, and he sends a messenger, Rabshakeh, to ask for Judah's surrender. And at this time, Hezekiah is the king of Judah, and we learn that in chapter 18, Hezekiah is a good king, that he revered God, he abolished idol worship in Judah, and at this time, Judah's prophet is none other than Isaiah. And so the two of them have Judah on the right track, and then here comes this Assyrian army, and they've conquered Israel. They've conquered all the other lands to the north of them, and they've conquered some of Judah's land, and they're pressing in towards Jerusalem, seemingly unstoppable. Initially, Hezekiah was afraid of Sennacherib, and he actually tried to barter with him and offer him tribute so that he would not completely take over Judah and Jerusalem. This did not work, though, and Rabshakeh continued to come, and he actually came 3 times demanding their surrender. Hezekiah's fear in all this was very normal. The Assyrian army had laid waste to several kings in battle. They had taken their lands and their people. They had a very large army and likely were much more powerful than any army that the Judeans could muster at this time. When Rabshakeh came the 3rd time, he had a written notice to surrender, and he mocked Hezekiah's God, saying, look at all the other gods that had not been able to stand up to Sennacherib. And in verse 12, he says, did the gods of the nations that my predecessors destroyed rescue them? Nations such as Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, the Edenites. Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, and several others? And so all of these kingdoms had been destroyed and those people taken over. And, on the face of it, just anyone looking in from the outside, it would seem that that's the ultimate thing that's going to happen to Jerusalem as well. Hezekiah took this letter, though, and he laid it out before God, and he began to pray. And in the meantime, the Bible tells us that at this same time, Isaiah had prophesied that the Assyrians would not take Jerusalem and Judah would be restored. Hezekiah praying shows great wisdom in noting the difference between our God and man-made gods or idols. The gods of the kingdoms the Assyrians had conquered weren't true gods, and Hezekiah knew this. And in verse 18, he even says, they've thrown their gods into the fire because they were not gods, for they were not gods, but they were made by human hands, wood and stone, so they have destroyed them. And so he understands the difference between the true God and something that people use to fill the void where God should be in their lives. Um, he also prays in verse 19 to be saved from being taken over, but not just so they could be saved, but also so that God would be glorified. And that's a great lesson for us when we pray for things, to always be looking for God's glory and not just comfort for ourselves. When we seek, when we seek healing, when we seek success in some endeavor that we're trying to do for ourselves or others, we should always seek it for God's glory, not just so bad things don't happen to us or that we don't feel bad. And so I thought that was a great lesson packed into this story here. Not long after Hezekiah prays to God, Isaiah sends a message to him that's God's answer to the prayer. God tells Hezekiah that the Assyrians that had mocked him, they are, all the great feats up to this point. And he reveals that he's planned this from the beginning, actually. So God's planned that the Assyrians would come down through and be able to conquer these other kingdoms. And he had a very specific purpose for that. God's going to draw a line at Jerusalem and turn the Assyrians back the way they came. And these verses, verse 20 through 28, they're not in our lesson, but they've got some very strong imagery in them. And I would encourage your class to read them if they hadn't already, because it's some great poetry, but just a great lesson too that accents everything else in here. It talks about, sometimes God's working a great work and we can't see it because it's hurting us or it's messing up our plans. And it's hard to submit to God in those times when you're in the valley. But Hezekiah did so. We know that Hezekiah was already afraid of Sennacherib, but he wasn't going to simply just yield because he had faith in God. And so he's praying this prayer. He's not buckling under the pressure like we've seen so many others do in Israel's past and Judah's. And so that's a big lesson there for us, I think, to lean on God. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So going on down to verse 32, Isaiah wraps up God's answer by telling Hezekiah that Sennacherib will not enter the city. And he uses some very specific phrases. He will not shoot an arrow there, or come against it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound against it. So what Isaiah is telling him is there's not even going to be a battle. Okay, Sennacherib's simply going to walk away, which in the situation they're in seems ludicrous. But it's so interesting. On page 103 in our book, there's this fascinating story about a discovery made in 1850. They discovered Sennacherib's tomb in Nineveh, which was his capital city. And they found carvings of the conquering of Lachish, which was another city and kingdom that he had conquered in Judea. And it showed that these very things, arrows, shields, and a siege ramp. So isn't it interesting that those are the very things mentioned in the Bible? It's not going to happen to Jerusalem because those were that was the MO for Sennacherib for conquering these cities. So that's exactly how he's planning on doing it. And Isaiah knew that through God. So God's saying he's not going to allow any of these things to happen. There's not even going to be a battle. And so, the reason for that in verse 34, he says, is for my sake, for God's sake, and David's sake. So the story of Jesus is continuing on and going to continue on in the face of incredible odds. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. So it's just a great, great story, and you might want to talk about that for a little bit in your class. And then after this, we find out that that's exactly what happens. That night, an angel of the Lord kills 185 Assyrian soldiers in their sleep. A single angel. And, it's really not even fair, is it? Well, anyway, the next morning, Sennacherib and those that are left wake up. They discover that their numbers have been incredibly diminished. They don't know what's happened. So they actually leave in fear and go back to all the way to Nineveh. They don't just retreat and try to remuster and figure out what to do. They leave completely and go all the way back to Nineveh. And then a few weeks later, Sennacherib is in the temple worshiping one of the idols, and his sons come in and kill him. And so, here's this army that has basically won every battle with not a lot of resistance coming up to Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, they not only have to retreat, they have to just leave and completely forget about trying to take over Jerusalem or going any further south. And, that's God. That's God. And Hezekiah knew that. God heard Hezekiah's prayer. Even though he was working his plan, he wanted Hezekiah to lean on him for his strength, and he rewarded him for it. And to me, that's the biggest lesson in this, is that we need to learn that our only strength is God's strength, but that's the only strength we need. And if we would quit relying on ourselves and just rely on Him, we would be so much more at peace, I think. And I know I would. And so that to me is the pinnacle of the lesson, and a good point to talk about with your class. And again, Hezekiah was under a lot of pressure. We get put under a lot of pressure today, especially in our society. If we just lean on God for our strength and get in the Word, that's where comfort and strength is. So I hope you guys have a great lesson. Appreciate you listening to me, and I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you Sunday.